Welcome, students, to our Novato History Museum. My name is Sharon, and I am so excited to be able to share some of our interesting exhibits with you today. Okay, this building we're about to enter was a home of Novato's first postmaster named Henry Jones. You have your mail delivered to you every day by your mailman or mailwoman, but in the early days of Novato, the mail only went to the postmaster. People then had to go to him to pick up their mail and packages. Henry Jones met a very sad ending. Late in the evening of March 22nd, 1872, his wife Mary couldn't find him anywhere. Mary searched all over their property, but she couldn't find Henry. She finally went over to their water trough, which was used to water their animals. This water trough had a wooden lid on it so no one would fall in. When Mary lifted the wooden lid, what do you think she found? Yep, the body of poor Mr. Jones, who apparently had been murdered. Now, this murder was never solved, so perhaps his ghost came along in his home when this building was moved here in 1972. This bell we have here actually hung in Novato's second schoolhouse, which was built in 1875 at a cost of $1,800. Now, that building was located where today you could go and purchase a Happy Meal. Of course, yes, it's located where our McDonald's hamburgers is located today. The bell was actually used the same way the bells are used at your school today. To tell the students when it was time to come in the morning, to go in and out at recess and lunch, and of course to go home at the end of the day. Now, what do you think a bell like this cost? Well, it came from New York and it cost $25. I think it's time we ring our bell. Before we enter the museum, I'd just like to point out this metal cart here. Does anybody have an idea what this cart might have been used for? Well, if anybody guessed mining, you'd be absolutely correct. Now, why would we need a mining cart in Novato? Believe me, if we had gold here, I'd be home digging up my backyard right now. Well, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, when it rained, the streets would become very muddy. So San Francisco decided to pave their streets with cobblestones. Many of these cobblestones actually came from a quarry that was located up on our Mount Verdell, which is in the San Marin area of Novato, kind of behind Mary's Pizza Shack. These large stones were then shipped down to San Francisco. So Novato actually helped to pave San Francisco. Now that we're actually inside the museum, I'd like to talk a little bit about the early history of Novato. Of course, the first people living here were the Miwok Indians. We don't have a lot on the Indians here in our museum because Novato, fortunately, has a wonderful Indian museum that you can visit. We do, however, have this mortar and pestle so that we can show that the Indians were actually the first people living in this area. Many years ago, this area of California was under the control of Mexico, who itself was under the control of Spain. Now, people living here at the time were called Californios, and they raised beef. Now, the homes they built were out of adobe, which was a very hard clay that hardened so it made very strong buildings. Here, we have an actual picture of what one of those ranches possibly had looked like in the day. Now, why did they raise beef? Well, I'm sure many of you have said for milk, but dairy cattle didn't come to the area till much later. This saddle that we have displayed in our museum is made from what material? Leather, of course. Now, the beef they raised were also a good source of meat, but they also were a very important source of leather from their hide, which they were able to use to make all kinds of items like hats and boots and gloves and belts and many other things that they use daily. Soap and candles were also made from the fat which was under the cattle's hide, which was known as tallow. Now the candles were especially important because it was dark at night and that was their only source of light. I know when the power's been out in your house, you probably have had to use candles for light. I am holding here an actual calf skin. I wish you could feel how soft this is on both sides. The other thing is, by looking at the size, because this is a calf, which was a baby, you get an idea of just how large the grown beef were. Now, with all those cattle roaming around on all that unfenced acreage, how did the owners know which cattle were theirs? Well, the next item I'm going to show you is this. It's called a branding iron, and it was used to help identify the owners of the cattle. And usually on these branding irons, they would have either the owner's initials or the symbol of their ranch. Now, the one I'm holding here actually belonged to a rancher named John Souza. John for the J, S for the Souza. Now, how they would use these is they would build a large fire and they would put this into the fire and the coals until it was red hot on the back side of the cattle, and his brand would be permanently burned into their hide. In 1821, Mexico fought a very costly war, but was finally able to win their independence from Spain. They owed many people who had helped them win this war. Now, they didn't have any money, but they had all the land of California. So to compensate those that helped them during the war, they gave out large areas of land, and these were known as land grants. Now, Novato originally consisted of 5 very large land grants. The pictures we have up here in our museum are of Ignacio Pacheco and his wife. He was given one of those land grants called Rancho de San Jose. Now, some of you may remember or realize that some of the streets and boulevards in that area still carry those names. In fact, we have San Jose Middle School, which is located on the original land grant. There is a large home that was built by his son Gumersindo, which is still standing today and is owned by some of the original Pacheco descendants. You can actually see that home when you're driving south on 101, kind of in the area where the Burger King is. Another one of these land grants was given to a gentleman called Fernando Velez, and it consisted of over 8,000 acres in 1839. Now, Fernando Velez built himself a home of adobe. It was actually one of the first homes built in Novato. Eventually, Rancho de Novato passed through several owners and then was bought by these two gentlemen, Joseph Sweetser and Mr. Francis DeLong. After passing through a few owners, partners Joseph Sweetser and Francis DeLong purchased the Rancho de Novato in 1856. Between 1856 and 1888, they planted over 20,000 apple trees, 3,600 pear trees, 3,000 apricot trees, 8,000 grapevines, and hundreds of cherry, peach, and almond trees. It was said that Novato had the world's largest apple orchard at the time. Here we have a lithograph showing what their orchards looked like at the time. Most of the fruit that they grew was shipped to other locations. It was generally placed in wooden crates, such as this here, from the Novato Land Company. Most of the fruit that was grown was sent to other locations, but some of the apples were actually kept here and pressed to make apple cider vinegar, which had many uses in the day. We have here in our museum an actual apple press. How this worked is you would take the apples, you wouldn't peel them or anything, you would place them in this area here. We have this large wheel here. As you turned it, there's metal in here, and it would crush the apples. It would all fall down into this bucket down here, which would be moved forward, and then this wheel would be turned, and this would be pressed down, and it would press on the apples, and out would come the delicious apple juice. Grapes are actually done the same process. They are crushed and pressed. Also pictured on that lithograph is the home that they built in 1865. We're lucky to have this replica in our museum showing how they lived in the day. A lot of the items are in miniature in here, but we also have some of those items in this display case. Here we have stereoscope, coffee grinder. That funny wire thing was actually called a rug beater. We have a chamber pot. And down here, we have a little darning egg. Yes, I actually said darning egg. So when they got a hole, they would take this darning egg, which was shaped like an egg, and then they could pull the sock over the egg and make it taut, and then they could stitch up the hole. Most of you are probably wondering just what is a chamber pot? Well, in the early days, there was no indoor plumbing or electricity. So the bathrooms they used were often built outside the home, and this was called an outhouse. So it wasn't always convenient to go out and use this outhouse, especially during the night. Now in the day, the bedrooms were known as bed chambers. So this chamber pot would become your toilet. Yuck, I know, but it wasn't so easy and convenient back in those days. So when you visit our museum, you need to look inside our home to see how many of these items are in there in miniature. Here we have a few other items that were used in the day. This was an iron. I wish you were here to feel just how heavy this iron is. This also is another coffee grinder. Now this is an egg beater. You could use it obviously to whip eggs, but my favorite use would have been to whip whipped cream. Here we have a masher, which was most often used probably to make mashed potatoes. Now, one of the smallest items I have here is a little child's leather boot. Now, if you notice, it has buttons. Back in the day, that was one of the ways to fasten shoes. Now, a lot of these buttons were very small, so they could become pretty hard to fasten. So how you would use your button hook is you would use this to pull this over to fasten the buttons. So when women finally got a sewing machine, there still was no electricity. So to operate this machine, they would have to push with their foot on the pedal, which would make the wheel go around and eventually would make the needle go up and down to create the stitches. Does anyone know what important thing happened in California in 1849? Eureka! Yes, gold was discovered. Now this made California a very important territory, so it was given statehood the following year. Now, in the late 1800s, the ships could no longer sail up the Novato Creek because of all the silt that had formed. But luckily, another mode of transportation came to Novato in 1879. Does anybody have a guess what that might be? I'm going to blow this. Yep, it was the train. Now here we actually have some tracks that actually ran through Novato. Now on your downtown tour video, you will see the Novato Depot. But here we have some pictures of some of the other depots that were in the area. There was one in Ignacio, one in Black Point, and one in Hamilton. Now, there was many very serious train accidents that happened in Novato. Fortunately, a lot of the main injuries were burns because the engines were steam. Now, the distance between the rails here was known as the gauge. At one time, the gauge on the rails was different throughout the United States, so trains could not travel on all the tracks. In 1892, when Abraham Lincoln was president, standard gauge was actually set at 4 feet 8.5 inches. So now the trains could travel throughout the entire United States. Passenger service was discontinued in Novato in 1955, but fortunately we have the smart train that you can ride on today. Novato is actually in the process of deciding the future use of its downtown depot. What do you think might be a good use for the building? Here we have a doctor's bag that belonged to Dr. Ralph Wiesman, who began practicing in Novato in 1933. Now, why would a doctor need such a bag? Well, when I was little, Dr. Wiesman would come to my house when I was sick. Doctors made many home visits to their patients, so they needed to carry the bags to have all the things they needed to treat them. Wouldn't that have been nice if the doctor would come to your house when you were feeling sick? Now, Dr. Wiesman was also instrumental in bringing Novato's first hospital here in 1961. Another interesting fact about Dr. Wiesman is his office was always closed on Saturdays because his religion was Seventh-day Adventists and they hold their religious services on Saturdays. His office was often open on Sundays though. Here we have a picture of some gentlemen milking the cattle. There's something very interesting about the stools that they are using. They were called a third-legged stool. Here in our museum, we actually have a third-legged stool. You probably wonder why I'm saying third-legged when it only has one leg. Well, how do you milk cows? Of course, you milk them by hand, except nowadays some of the dairies have some modern new equipment that they use. But back in the day, the ranchers had to go and milk by hand. Now the cows were just out in the field, so they had to go from cow to cow. So to help them to carry their bucket, which was needed to catch the milk, they had this third-legged stool, which they would attach to their bodies, so that when they would go down to milk, that third leg would go down and would help them to balance. It would actually create their stool. So then they had their hands free to milk the cow. Here we have a magnet that was used by the ranchers. They would feed these magnets to the cattle. Why would they feed them to the cattle? Well, what sticks to magnets? Iron and steel, of course. When the cows were grazing out in the field, they could ingest some of these metals, such as fence nails and wire. If that happened and it got into their stomachs, it could do some major damage or could have killed the cow. The idea was when they had this magnet in them that all those metals would stick to the magnet so then it wouldn't move around and do any damage to the cow. Now the ranchers didn't waste anything, so oftentimes when these cows died, they would retrieve that magnet and they would use it again. Here we have a picture of the DeBorba Dairy Ranch that was located on Olive. Today the property is owned by Marin County and is the Deer Island Open Space Preserve. It is open to the public and is a wonderful place to go hiking. So eventually, Rancho de Novato was broken up into many small ranches and dairies. Now Sweetser retained 1 square mile for himself, which actually is most of what is downtown Novato today. His son, John Sweetser, actually built a really beautiful home, which was at the end of Elm Avenue. Unfortunately, that home was razed, meaning it was torn down in 1960 to build apartments. Novato was very known for its dairies. At one time, there was actually 4 cheese factories operating here. Here we actually have a butter wrapper from the Burdell Creamery. Now, does anybody remember what Burdell is? Well, Mount Burdell is where the quarry was located. The mountain was named for Galen Burdell, who was a dentist. He received that property as a wedding gift from his father-in-law, James Black, when he married his daughter, Mary. The property was known as Olimpoli, and today is a state park that you can visit. Here, we have a large alarm clock that was in a chicken ranch on Atherton Avenue. Who would this alarm clock need to wake up? Well, if any of you guessed the chickens, you'd be correct. Why would you need to wake up the chickens? Well, the chicken ranchers needed these chickens to be laying eggs, so on those dark mornings, the alarm would go off and wake up the chickens and turn on the light, so then they would begin laying. We also have a little chick feeder. In a ceramic water bowl. Now, how does your milk come from the store? Most of you would say in a carton. Back in the day, milk was packaged in bottles, such as these here. A lot of them would have the name of the dairies printed on the outside of the bottles. This I'm holding here is a small milk bottle. These were probably used as milk for students in school. How does your milk come to you in school? Probably still comes in cartons, not bottles. This is our newest exhibit in our museum on the history of the Novato Fire Department. The first volunteer fire department was formed in June of 1894 to deal with the many yearly grass fires that threatened the businesses and homes. Novato was granted township in 1926 by the Marin County, and the first Novato Fire District was formed. The first fire station was built in 1930 and was located at the corner of Grant Avenue and Redwood Boulevard. The personnel consisted of 17 people, but 15 were still unpaid volunteers. Here we have an actual fire suit that was worn by a Novato firefighter. Today, the Novato Fire District maintains 5 fire stations, 89 firefighters and administrators, protects 71 square miles, and a population of over 63,000 people. Here we actually have a few pictures of some of the larger fires that happened in Novato, including the Black Point Inn and the Food Fair Market. Okay, we're now located on our buggy porch. Why do we call it a buggy porch? Well, of course, because of this beautiful buggy that we have stored here. It is a 1902 Sears Roebuck runabout, and it ran on actual horsepower, meaning real horses. What is different about this buggy than the cars, the trucks that you travel in today? Well, one thing, it does not have a roof. So when it was raining, you would get very wet. And on days that it was really hot, you would be very uncomfortable. Another big difference is the tires on your car are made of rubber. Now these wheels were actually wood and metal, so it would not be a very smooth ride on a lot of those uneven dirt roads in the day. What do you think a buggy like this cost in those days? Well, it cost the same as our school bell. If you remember, that was $25. You definitely have a very good memory. Now, $25 does not sound like very much. But in 1902, if a man was working outside his home, he generally only made about $1 a day, meaning it would take him almost a full month just to be able to buy his buggy. And then he still had to buy the horse to pull it, which probably cost way more. Here we have an actual wooden washing machine for washing your clothes. How this operated is you would put the water and the soap and the dirty clothes inside, close the lid, and you would turn this large wheel back here. That would cause the water to agitate, meaning it would move back and forth to clean the clothes. Now this would have had an attachment known as a wringer, because the clothes would be very wet and you would need to wring some of the water out of it before you could hang them on the line, otherwise they would be very heavy. Not everyone would be lucky enough to own one of these nice washing machines, but they still had laundry to do. What they would do is they would get a large tub, fill it with soap, water, and their dirty clothes, and then they would use this item here, which is a copper agitator. How this would work is they would put this into the bucket of water and it would go up and down, which would cause the water to move around to clean the clothes. Now the clothes in those days were not permanent press, meaning they wrinkled. You still had to get the wrinkles out. So those clothes would need to be ironed. And again, these are very heavy irons. They would be heated on the stove, and the girls would probably have to do the ironing. This item I'm holding here is actually a butter churn. And how this worked is there is a paddle inside. You would put the cream and you would have to turn this crank right here, and then you would end up with some nice, sweet, fresh butter. This item here was called a yoke. And how this would be used is you would put it on your neck and it would help you to carry heavy items. Now 2 buckets would be attached to these ropes and they probably would have water in them. So it would help you to balance while you carry. Now in the day, boys and girls each had chores they needed to do to help out. The boys would probably have used the yokes, and sorry girls, you would have used the irons. Sometimes the clothes became really, really dirty. So to help to get that out, Mom would have to use this washboard. She would have to rub the clothes up and down to break loose the stains. Laundry was quite a chore to do. Hanging here, we have a different type of a yoke. This yoke would have been used to put on the animals to pull the wagons. Here is a picture of what that looked like with the oxen pulling the wagons. I want to thank you all for being such excellent listeners today. I have really enjoyed being able to share some of our exhibits we have here inside our Novato History Museum. I hope you all take the time to come and safely visit to see all our exhibits and artifacts and to continue learning about your city's history. Novato has many things that make it a truly unique place.